Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 19th ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The History That God Has Here. Our speaker is Michael Ignatieff, a professor in the History Department of the Central European University, and its former president and rector. He formerly was the Edward Murrow Chair of Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Michael is an international commentator of contemporary issues of democracy, human rights, and governance. He also is an award-winning writer, teacher, former politician, and historian with a deep knowledge of Central and Eastern Europe. He received his doctorate in history from Harvard University and has held academic posts at King's College, Cambridge, the University of Toronto, and the University of British Columbia. He served in the Canadian Parliament and was the leader of the Liberal Party. He's the author of many books, and those published after 2010 are Fire and Ashes, Success and Failure in Politics, The Ordinary Virtues, Moral Order in a Divided World, and On Consolation, Finding Solace in Dark Times. Today's webinar is about the war in Ukraine. What we need to understand is a war launched by a Russian president to deny a neighboring country its right to exist, the refusal of Ukraine to accept its fate, the convulsive remaking of the international order, and how a new fear has crept into our sense of the European future, a sense of foreboding, as bleak as those blackened ruins of Mariupol. Without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to need a little help. For some reason, my screen is set up so I can't. There we go. Great. I can recover my notes. Otherwise, I would have to improvise in front of a Milanese audience for 50 minutes. That sounds like a pretty terrifying possibility, but I do thank you for this invitation, and I thank you all for coming to listen. I've got some notes from which I will talk briefly, but I don't think I will talk longer than about 20-25 minutes, and then I hope we will get into questions, and I particularly welcome your questions. This is a talk really about the uses of history in this conflict and trying to get a sense of where the history starts. And where you start your history tends to define how you position yourself. And so history is a justificatory tool in this battle used on all sides. And I'm trying to think about this clearly. The headline that I think I have for this is that this war in Ukraine is really a story about the liquidation of the last European land empire. And so we need to think of it in the history of decolonization. We need to think of it along with the end of the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French Empire. The last empire was the Soviet Empire. And Russia is deeply resistant to the conclusion, the decolonization of the Soviet space. And this is the battle. This is the full historical dimension of the battle that we're looking at. Let me get up my notes and talk a little bit about some of the issues as I see them. The Ukrainians keep reminding us that the war didn't start in 2022, but with Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, followed in 2008 by the war against Georgia, and then the seizure of Donbass and Crimea in 2014. But if you turn to Vladimir Putin's own history of the war, this notorious essay called On the Historical Unity of the Russians and Ukrainians, which he apparently researched himself in his dacha outside Moscow and then put together last summer, the justification for the war really goes back to the 10th century AD when Vladimir adopts Christianity a Viking prince in Kiev adopts Christianity, begins the Orthodox conversion of the Russians. And so why does Putin begin there? He begins with the claim that since Russia began in Kiev, Kiev must belong to Russia. Now, most histories of Russia do start with Kiev and Rus, but what's new in Putin's version of the story is denying another country its right to exist. So in the Putin historiography, Russia gets a grand myth of origins going back to Kiev and Rus, while the actual government in Kiev gets told, this country is not yours, but mine. And it's interesting that an ex-KGB officer who's skilled in the martial arts and presumably in the skills of killing people with your own hands should feel need to have a historical myth of origin at all. I mean, if you've got the tanks and the artillery and the ships, why not just take what you want? But, and Putin certainly didn't bother with justification when he had journalists shot on their doorsteps, when opposition politicians were murdered within sight of the Kremlin, and when agents were dispatched to poison people in other people's countries. Didn't bother with justification then, but here he appears to require a very elaborate historical apparatus of justification, and every dictator does. I mean, Hitler had his suffering Sudeten Germans, and Putin has his suffering Russians groaning under the Ukrainian yoke. But I think he's reaching for a grander historical register, which is he actually wants to enter history himself. This is about consecrating Putin as a maker of history by restoring the Russian Empire of Peter and Catherine, the Russian Empire from the Gulf of Finland to the Black Sea. Of course, if he'd actually wanted to emulate Peter and Catherine, he would have had to open Russia up as they did, instead of closing it down. So it's possible that his actual Tsarist model is not Peter and Catherine, but Tsar Nicholas I, who crushed the Decembrist uprising in 1825 and made himself the gendarme of Europe for the next 25 years. And he crushed the independence of the Poles in 1831. He crushed the Hungarian rebellion in 1849. And I mentioned these antecedents simply to point out the deep continuities in Putin's use of Russian power in relation to its neighbors. It's important not to think of Putin as a kind of one-off Soviet-style tyrant. This is inscribed in the deeper patterns of Russian history. And that pattern has been repeated in the 20th century. You hardly need tell you that the Soviets kept up that Tsarist pattern by marching the tanks into Budapest in 1956, into Prague in 1968, forcing their Polish regime to impose martial law on Warsaw in 1981. So this mold has been deeply set from the 18th century. No Russian state, Tsarist or Soviet, has been able to tolerate a free state on its borders. And that may be the key European security dilemma ever since. It's the most serious unresolved problem in European security, which is, can a Russia, not Putin's Russia, obviously, but can a future Russia live side by side with a free state on its borders? This is the issue that's being fought out as we speak. Now, he has then created, in order to justify this attack on a free people, an entire historical fantasy, which I don't need to rehearse to you. It's all about the Nazis. And it's a fantastic concoction to attack a government led by a person whose origins happen to be Jewish, and to argue that you're intervening to protect Russian speakers who face no threat at all, either to their language or to their culture or to their freedom. And many of them, as you know, have rallied. In fact, most of them have rallied to the Ukrainian cause. So he has concocted a historical fantasy that is really only possible when you are a dictator whom nobody dares to contradict. The historical fantasy, in other words, is dependent on the prior creation of a totalitarian space in which no one can contradict you. And we know how this has happened over the last 20 years, the crushing of independent journalism, the silencing of university faculties of history, the neutering of NGOs as foreign agents. And it then means that when Putin speaks, his voice echoes across the Asian plains all the way out to the Pacific coast and back, and he never hears a dissenting voice back, which then locks this historical fantasy in. And because the media are so entirely controlled, he can count on getting a reception from his own audience. So the concoction of historical myth is deeply dependent on the systematic suppression of democracy inside Russia. And this then means that the fantasy supports, sustains, and builds upon the totalitarian project. But it's interesting if you delve deeper into his historical fantasy. You all know that he's someone who said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And he certainly believes that. But one of the interesting things in his essay is that he blames Khrushchev for handing Crimea over to the Ukraine in 1954. And he castigates Lenin for giving Ukraine a state within the USSR at the end of the Civil War. So there's an interesting dichotomy here. This is a creation, Putin is a creation of the Soviet historical canon, but his historical story is a direct contradiction of what Stalin and Lenin said about the nationality question in the 20th century. So his use of the Soviet past is strictly instrumental, discarding whatever contradicts his narrative. But he does take care over the sole remaining source of the legitimacy of his regime, which is that his regime is the heir of the regime that beat Hitler. And we saw all of this on display yesterday at the holiday celebrating the Great Patriotic War. And what we saw was a fantastic reverse alchemy in which gold is turned into dross, because the one untrammeled good of the Soviet era, the one achievement that's a source of pride both within the Russian people and also is honored by all of us, is that it was the Russians who fought their way into Auschwitz and saved Europe from Hitler's racial empire. And this glorious memory has been dragged into the Ukrainian mud to legitimize a criminal act of savagery against a democratic state. Now, there isn't a state in the world that doesn't misuse and abuse history for its own purposes. Putin is not the only leader to construct history to justify tyranny and abuse. And every society lies about itself all the time. But there's some lies that can kill a society. And I've written about this quite a bit. I call these the impermissible lies, the lies that can kill the possibility of democratic truth in a society. These lies are enormous challenges, enormous obstacles to freedom, and societies get a rare opportunity to deal with them. The United States had to deal with slavery in 1865. Germany had to deal with the Nazi horror in 1945. South Africa had to deal with apartheid in 1994. And what dealing with it mean is just drawing up a very short list of things that society will never say about itself again, such as slavery was pretty good for Black people, or Hitler was right about the Jews, or apartheid wasn't really so bad. And these are the impermissible lies that can kill a society dead. And Russia had the same chance in 1991 to basically say never again Stalin. It could have reckoned with the Gulag. It could have told the truth about the millions who died at the hands of his regime. But no reckoning occurred, and a kind of narcotic silence descended as the last land empire in Europe collapsed. Now, Western advisors have their share of blame in all this, because they basically told the new governors of Russia that history didn't matter, and that all that was needed was economic shock therapy and a rapid conversion to a market. And that was all that was necessary to rid a country from 80 years of tyranny. But in fact, what the country needed most of all in 1991 to 99 was a reckoning with history. And there had been Russian voices, as I'm sure you know, who've been telling the truth about the Soviet past all along, but they weren't listened to. Akhmatova, Brodsky, Sakharov, Solzhenitsyn, they never got the chance to imprint their message on the country's soul. There were no truth commissions, no attempts, as there were in South Africa, to root out the impermissible lies and leach them, drain them out of the society. And what then happened was a kind of blank page emerged in the 1990s on which Putin could then eventually write his Ukrainian fable, this fable of Mother Russia intervening to save her children from the Nazis. And it's symptomatic of this narcotic silence about the past, this blank page that weeks before Putin launched his invasion, his regime shut down Memorial, which, as you know, is the last remaining Russian organization that had done heroic work in documenting the realities of Gulag and Stalin's terror. So we're now in an extraordinary example of a country literally being poisoned by its own impermissible lies. And this, I think, lies behind the hermetically sealed culture of approbation that continues to surround this operation inside Russia. Now, Putin's history lesson may be fiction, and a malignant fiction at that, but it tells us something about his objectives. He's not going to be satisfied with Donbass, with the land bridge across Mariupol, with the gas fields of Azov, the Sea of Azov, or even control the Black Sea coast. It's the entire Ukraine that he wants to eliminate. If he cannot have it all, he will bide his time until he gets it later. And that's why, even if the current fighting concludes with some kind of ceasefire, this war will continue until either Putin is defeated or until he discovers it's impossible to realize these objectives. And the objective simply is to wipe Ukraine off the map, because he denies its very existence with 1,000 years of false history. If he's beaten off, he may settle, but he'll only settle provisionally and seek to have a prostrate and devastated Ukraine on his border. Because he knows that if he was actually to be defeated in Ukraine, he knows that when Russian regimes fail in battle, and the Tsarist regime, for example, lost the battle with the Japanese in 2005, and that defeat began its own collapse, he knows that any Russian regime that faces defeat on the battlefield is looking at its own collapse as a regime. And this is what makes, as everybody's saying, this Russian leader particularly dangerous, because he faces humiliation on the battlefield, and facing humiliation, he may not shy away from the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And he's especially dangerous because he's angry. His military have failed him, his intelligence services have failed him. The Ukrainians have ripped apart this account of reality and forced him to confront the resilience of a people he himself believes shouldn't exist. He's made a crucial misunderstanding of the Ukrainian people, but so have most of NATO and Europe. They made precisely the same mistake as Putin. They thought that the Ukrainians they were dealing with were still the Sovietized people of the 1990s, and they simply didn't understand what the Maidan uprising of 2004 had done to the consciousness of an entire people. I commend to you the extraordinary film made about the Maidan uprising, which I think you can get on Netflix, but it tells you something that we're apt to forget about Maidan, is that it went on for 92 nights during the winter of 2014. And it was a constant running battle between the youth of Ukraine and many of older people as well against the hated Berkut, the military police of the Yanukovych regime. And that battle, it seems to me, put iron in the soul of Ukrainians. And it put iron in the soul in terms of their conviction that their future lay with Europe, lay with the West. And that's why joining the European Union remains the core, unperishable goal of the Zelensky government. And they learned it on the Maidan, because that was the cry of the young people who fought the Berkut so bravely. Maidan should have taught Putin what he was dealing with. He was dealing with a people who had come to a deep personal national consciousness. We're all very down on nationalism, but this is an example of nationalism as a kind of coming awake and a joint mobilization around a couple of facts, which are that we want to live in freedom, we want to live as Europeans, and we want to be militarily prepared. After the defeats in Donbass over the last 8 years, the Ukrainian military has rebuilt itself, and we didn't see this coming, and neither Putin nor NATO understood just what national coming awake after Maidan had done, both to national consciousness, but also to military preparedness. We failed to see, in other words, what adversity, what a genuine existential threat can do to a people's psyche. Now that we see this, we run a risk, I think, of sentimentalizing Ukraine. They're fighting for our values, but we're not the ones doing the dying. And Ukrainians have discovered, like the Afghans before them, how painful it is to be someone else's proxy. They want our air cover, but they're not going to get it. They want aircraft, modern aircraft, they're not going to get it. We've made the decision, we want to support their values, but we don't want to risk a third world war. This is, in other words, a very tense relationship, charged with emotional identification with Ukraine, but not going sufficiently to give them the material they need necessarily to win the war. And so this, we may be replaying the bitter experience that the Hungarians experienced in 56, 68, and the Poles experienced in 81, which is namely, you're on your own. As you look to the future, I mean, it seems fatuous to make predictions because this is going to be decided on a battlefield. It's not going to be decided by diplomats. It's going to be decided by the courageous people fighting those trenches in Donbass. But there may be an issue in which the Zelensky government decides that it has to settle for a peace that leaves substantial parts of Ukraine in Russian hands. And I think we can envisage a Finnish peace, the peace analogous to the peace that the Finns had to make with Stalin in the spring of 1940. We remember how bravely the Finns fought, but we tend to forget how it ended. It ended with the Soviet troops occupying a considerable portion of Finland. It did end with a guarantee of the Finnish sovereignty, which has remained to this day, and that's a good omen. But we forget that the president of Finland, who signed this document that brought peace in 1940, famously said, "Let the hand withers that signs this monstrous treaty." And those are words that President Zelensky may come to understand only too well. Let me work towards a conclusion as quickly as I can so that we have time for questions. There's some other things about Putin's understanding, historical understanding here, that have been proven wrong. He's got Ukraine wrong, needless to say, but he's also got the United States and its alliance system wrong. I think he reeled in a tremendous amount of European and American self-doubt about the state of our democracy, the cohesion of our alliances. One of the features of the last 20 years has been the frequency with which we in the West have talked the language of decadence, the language of crisis in democracy, the crisis of our military preparedness, and a deep cultural crisis. Were we willing to fight for anything? Were we willing to believe in anything? All that kind of stuff. This is a very standard feature of democratic self-doubt in times of prosperity. But I think Putin took this decadence language that he got out of the West and took it as true. And I think China did the same. And I think they've discovered that the reality is more complicated. Both NATO and the European Union have been slapped awake by this crisis. And in fact, the danger I think that we have in the West is not kind of supine, decadent, passive resignation, but the dangers of too much passion, passion that will cause us to forget prudence and forget to maintain the balance we need to maintain, that will keep us from plunging the world into a European and possibly a nuclear war. And let's understand how tough maintaining this balance is. We'll have to shut our ears to desperate people. We'll have to shut our ears to desperate pleas from people who've been truly wronged. We'll have to shut our ears to those pleas for, no fly, for example, but we must not walk away. And we are going to need to make some sacrifices, some real ongoing enduring sacrifices relating to that will follow from the embargo on Russian oil and gas. And we need to do that sacrifice without pitching the world into an abyss. I think we've had to face, we've had to come awake from our own rhetoric of decadence. But I think we've also had to come awake with certain pacifist illusions, the illusion that war was over on the European continent, that we'd entered a world beyond war itself. This is a lesson we keep having to relearn. Before 1914, our great-grandparents thought that economic integration would make war a thing of the past. We've learned that the economic integration of geostrategic rivals is no guarantee of peace, never was, never will be. We used to believe that nuclear weapons make great war impossible, but now that we have miniaturized, tactical, battlefield nuclear weapons, we're no longer so sure about that either. And we're in genuinely uncharted territory. We're in a place where, having talked about history for 20 minutes, history is giving us very few reliable guides at all. I think the one thing that is very clear is that we've left behind the world our grandparents bequeathed to us, the world of Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, Truman, in Italy, De Gasperi, the world of the UN Charter, those rules of the international order, that the two rules, the inviolability of sovereign states and the legitimate use of force vested only in the Security Council. We knew that those rules have been more honored in the breach than in the observance. We also knew that Russia was not the only one or even the first country to violate both of those rules at once. It's not been pleasant to have the Russians reminding the United States and its allies that these basic charter rules were breached in Kosovo and then again in Iraq. And we are living the consequences that the world outside Europe that looks at this conflict, I'm thinking of India, I'm thinking of Indonesia, I'm thinking of the Middle East, I'm thinking of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Latin America. All these states don't line up behind Europe, don't line up behind the United States, are sitting on the sidelines saying something like, "We told you so," saying something like, "You don't follow the rules of the international order either, so why should we be so upset about the Russian violation of Ukraine?" So the US and Europe may believe that we are facing up to Russian imperialism and presiding over the end of the last European land empire. That's our narrative. But some of the world believes that Russia is facing up to essentially American imperialism. Now, the idea that the West brought all of this upon ourselves through Kosovo, through Iraq, by making fatuous promises of NATO membership to Georgia and Ukraine, by extending NATO to the Russian frontier, that narrative lets Putin off the hook. It also does something we need to pay attention to, which is this idea that NATO expansion gave Putin a casus belli, neglects the extent to which Eastern Europe were historical agents of their own destiny. NATO expanded to the Russian frontier because the Poles, the Czechs, the Baltic states, and Hungary demanded it as a condition of their security and the very possibility of having a democracy on the Russian border. It's one of the fatuous ideas that both the left and the right have in this world, that the only agents of history are America, Russia, and China. In fact, small countries like Central and Eastern Europe, like the Baltic states, are agents in history, and they are responsible for some of the structure of the world that we now live in. And I make this point to conclude because, what is the Ukrainian cause but the desire of a small nation, one of those weak ones in Thucydides' Melian dialogues, the desire of a small nation to defend their right to remain free beside a great power. This is the same agency that the Taiwanese are claiming, the right to make their own history, to write their own narrative, despite geography, despite great powers, despite everything. And in the ruins of the world that we're now living in, that desire for people to be free, to write their own history, seems worth defending. I'll stop there. Thanks very much for listening.